I was sent to the Council on Foreign Relations banquet, carrying the credentials of a Pinkerton detective. My supposed role as Private Dick was to keep an eye on the jewels of the ladies and other valuables. My real job was to place a small bug on the table where Robert Putney Drake would be sitting. I was on loan to IRS that week, and they didn't know that Justice had standing orders never to prosecute him for anything, so they were trying to prove he had concealed income. Naturally, I also had an ear peeled for anything that might be of import for the Illuminati, the AA, and the CIA. If my Lincoln Memorial contact really was CIA and not military or naval intelligence or somebody else entirely. You can be sure I often meditated on the possibility that he might be Moscow, Peking, or Havana, and Winifred told me once that the Illuminati had reason to believe him part of an advance guard fifth column sent by invaders from Alpha Centauri. But Grandmasters of the Illuminati are notorious put-on artists, and I didn't buy that yarn any more than I bought the tale that had originally brought me into the Illuminati. The one about them being a conspiracy to establish a world government run by British Israelites. There was a hawk-faced wop at Drake's table, very elegant in a spanking new tuxedo, but the cop in me made him as illegit. Sometimes you can make a subject precisely, as bunco con, safe blower, armed robber, or whatnot, but I could only place him vaguely somewhere on that side of the game. In fact, I associated him with images of piracy on the high seas, or the kind of gambits the Borgias played. Somehow the conversation got around to a new book by somebody named Mortimer Adler, who had already written 100 or so great books if I understood the drift. One banker type at the table was terribly keen on this Adler, and especially on his latest great book.
He says that we and the communists share the same great tradition.
I could hear the caps by the way he pronounced the term.
And we must join together against the one force that really does threaten civilization, anarchism.
There were several objections in which Drake didn't take part. He just sat back, puffing his cigar and looking agreeable to everyone. But I could see boredom under the surface. And the banker tried to explain the great tradition, which was a bit over my head, and, judging by the expressions around the table, a bit over everybody else's head, too, when the hawk-faced Dago spoke up suddenly.
"I can put the great tradition in one word,"
he said calmly.
"Privilege."
Old Drake suddenly stopped looking agreeable but bored. He seemed both interested and amused.
"One seldom encounters such a refreshing freedom from euphemism," he said, leaning forward. "But perhaps I am reading too much into your remarks, sir."
Hawkface sipped at his champagne and patted his mouth with a napkin before answering.
"I think not," he said at last. "Privilege is defined in most dictionaries as a right or immunity giving special favors or benefits to those who hold it. Another meaning in Webster is not subject to the usual rules or penalties. The invaluable thesaurus gives such synonyms as power, authority, birthright, franchise, patent, grant, favor, and, I'm sad to say, pretension. Surely we all know what privilege is in this club, don't we, gentlemen? Do I have to remind you of the Latin roots, privi, private, and lege, law, and point out in detail how we have created our private law over here, just as the Politburo have created their own private law in their own sphere of influence?"
"But that's not the great tradition,"
the banker type said. Later I learned that he was actually a college professor. Drake was the only banker at that table.
"What Mr. Adler means by the great tradition—"
"What Mortimer means by the great tradition,"
Hawkface interrupted rudely,
"is a set of myths and fables invented to legitimize or sugarcoat the institution of privilege. Correct me if I'm wrong,"
he added more politely, but with a sardonic grin.
"He means,"
the true believer said,
"the undeniable axioms, the time-tested truths, the shared wisdom of the ages,
the myths and fables,"
Hawkface contributed gently.
"The sacred, time-tested wisdom of the ages,"
the other went on, becoming redundant.
"the basic bedrock of civil society, of civilization. And we do share that with the communists. And it is just that common humanistic tradition that the young anarchists on both sides of the Iron Curtain are blaspheming, denying, and trying to destroy. It has nothing to do with privilege at all."
"Pardon me,"
the dark man said.
"Are you a college professor?
Certainly. I'm head of the political science department at Harvard.
Oh,
The dark man shrugged.
I'm sorry for talking so bluntly before you. I thought I was entirely surrounded by men of business and finance.
The professor was just starting to look as if he spotted the implied insult in that formal apology when Drake interrupted.
Quite so. No need to shock our paid idealists and turn them into vulgar realists overnight. At the same time, is it absolutely necessary to state what we all know in such a manner as to imply a rather hostile and outside viewpoint? Who are you, and what is your trade, sir?
Agbargeline, import-export. Golden Appel transfers here in New York. A few other small establishments in other ports.
As he spoke, my image of piracy and Borgia stealth came back strongly.
And we're not children here,
he added.
So why should we avoid frank language?
The professor, taken aback a foot or so by this turn in the conversation, sat perplexed as Drake replied,
So, civilization is privilege, or private law, as you say so literally, and we all know where private law comes from, except the poor professor here, out of the barrel of a gun, in the words of a gentleman whose bluntness you would appreciate. It is your conclusion, then, that Adler is, for all his naivete, correct, and we have more in common with the communist rulers than we have setting us at odds.
Let me illuminate you further,
Gillian said, and the way he pronounced the verb made me jump. Drake's blue eyes flashed a bit, too, but that didn't surprise me. Anybody as rich as IRS thought he was would have to be on the inside.
Privilege implies exclusion from privilege, just as advantage implies disadvantage,
Gillian went on.
In the same mathematically reciprocal way, profit implies loss. If you and I exchange equal goods, that is trade. Neither of us profits and neither of us loses. But if we exchange unequal goods, one of us profits and the other loses. Mathematically, certainly. Now, such mathematically unequal exchanges will always occur because some traders will be shrewder than others. But in total freedom, in anarchy, such unequal exchanges will be sporadic and irregular, a phenomenon of unpredictable periodicity, mathematically speaking. Now, look about you, Professor. Raise your nose from your great books and survey the actual world as it is, and you will not observe such unpredictable functions. You will observe, instead, a mathematically smooth function, a steady profit accruing to one group and an equally steady loss accumulating for all others. Why is this, Professor? Because the system is not free or random, as any mathematician would tell you a priori. Well then, where is the determining function, the factor that controls the other variables? You have named it yourself, or Mr. Adler has. The great tradition. Privilege, I prefer to call it. When A meets B in the marketplace, they do not bargain as equals. A bargains from a position of privilege. Hence, he always profits and B always loses. There is no more free market here than there is on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The privileges of private laws, the rules of the game as promulgated by the Politburo and the General Congress of the Communist Party on that side, and by the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve Board on this side, are slightly different, that's all. And it is this that is threatened by anarchists, and by the repressed anarchist in each of us,
he concluded, strongly emphasizing the last clause, staring at Drake, not at the professor. The professor had a lot more to say in a hurry then, about the laws of society being the laws of nature, and the laws of nature being the laws of God, but I decided it was time to circulate a bit more, so I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. The IRS has a complete tape of it, I'm sure, since I had placed the bug long before the meal.
Appendix Zain. Property and privilege. Property is theft. P.J. Proudhon. Property is liberty. P.J. Proudhon. Property is impossible. P.J. Proudhon. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Proudhon, by piling up his contradictions this way, was not merely being French. He was trying to indicate that the abstraction property covers a variety of phenomena, some pernicious and some beneficial. Let us borrow a device from the semanticists and examine his triad with subscripts attached for maximum clarity. Property 1 is theft. Means that property 1, created by the artificial laws of feudal, capitalist and other authoritarian societies, is based on armed robbery. Land titles, for instance, are clear examples of property 1. Swords and shot were the original coins of transaction. Property 2 is liberty, means that property 2, that which will be voluntarily honoured in a voluntary anarchist society, is the foundation of the liberty in that society. The more people's interests are commingled and confused, as in collectivism, the more they will be stepping on each other's toes. Only when the rules of the game declare clearly, this is mine and this is thine, and the game is voluntarily accepted as worthwhile by all parties to it, can true independence be achieved. Property 3 is impossible, means that property 3 equals property 1 creates so much conflict of interest that society is in perpetual undeclared civil war and must eventually devour itself, and properties 1 and 3 as well. In short, Proudhon, in his own way, foresaw the snafu principle. He also foresaw that communism would only perpetuate and aggravate the conflicts, and that anarchy is the only viable alternative to this chaos. It is not averred, of course, that property 2 will come into existence only in a totally voluntary society. Many forms of it already exist. The error of most alleged libertarians, especially the followers of the egregious Ayn Rand, is to assume that all property 1 is property 2. The distinction can be made by any IQ above 70 and is absurdly simple. The test is to ask, of any title of ownership you are asked to accept or which you ask others to accept, would this be honoured in a free society of rationalists, or does it require the armed might of a state to force people to honour it? If it be the former, it is property 2 and represents liberty. If it be the latter, it is property 1 and represents theft.